And we are back. Welcome, students. This is your teacher, Mr. Jacobson, and I'm excited to be talking to you about the final webcast that will conclude our time with China. So, today we're going to be talking about the Qin Dynasty and the Han Dynasty. And there's a lot to cover, but some really interesting things come out of these dynasties, and including lots of inventions that are even still acknowledged today. So let us begin. So last we talked about the Zhou dynasty, and the Zhou, um, they started giving too much power to their um, to the lords, and they started losing their power of the king. So eventually they just got too weak, and the all these other lords and landowners who became really powerful, they started fighting each other. It was called the Warring States period. Well, one of those people who were fighting was the Qin, and it was led by a man named Qin, this guy right here. And he's the one that ultimately ends up, during the Warring States period, conquers everybody and unifies China once again. Now, he gave himself the title Shi Hongdi, which means first emperor. He created a strong government with strict laws and punishments. So Shi Hongdi, he was a really strong leader, and he was also very rigid. He was looked at as just a very hard, uh, uncompassionate person. So you were ordered to follow his orders. He followed legalism, and he burned all the writings that did not agree with legalism. He conquered all of China from the Gobi Desert all the way to the Shi River. His soldiers destroyed the walls to cities and took away all their weapons. And so here we have a guy who uh, will punish you if you don't follow him. That's not new. We have a guy who's burning all of the writings that disagrees with legalism. That is kind of new. We have a guy who is commanding all his soldiers to break the walls of cities and take away people's weapons. So it's interesting that we see that happening, because we saw the same thing happen leading up to World War II, and a man who started burning books that didn't agree with his philosophies and started taking weapons away from his people. His name was Adolf Hitler. So the emperor had all the power and did not share it with the lords, because think about it. He didn't share it with the lords because that was the end of the Zhou dynasty. The lords got too powerful. He forced peasants to work government projects. Emperor divided China into districts, each with its own governor. Each district had counties with an official. So you can see all the different counties, all the different officials, and of course there's the capital. So Qin hallmarks, things that people remember the Qin dynasty for. One, a unified China. Two, he began the project of the Great Wall. See, there were other leaders before Qin Shi Huangdi who built walls, but Shi Huangdi kind of connected all the walls. And then it became the Great Wall. Now, that Great Wall is going to keep being built on for many other dynasties, so it's not the same wall that you would necessarily see if you went to China today. He built roads all over, and of course, Shi Hongdi, he was buried with what we call the Terracotta Army. So they uncovered the tomb of Shi Hongdi, and the man was very proud of his army. He was a very powerful man, and he was always ready for a fight, and so he wanted to be buried. And I believe he was buried with, is it 6,000? I think it's 6,000 soldiers that look just like this. In fact, he had um, sculptors sculpt these individuals out of real army soldiers back in the day, and so each of these sculptures are different in features and clothing, etc. So quite a significant find for people to find, and he did that because he believed that if he brought his soldiers, he was buried with these terracotta warriors, that he would have warriors for the afterlife. So now we're going into the Han Dynasty. So years after the Qin Dynasty collapsed, Liu Bang won control and began the Han Dynasty. Now Liu Bang was a peasant and became the emperor because of the mandate of heaven. So we're hearing the mandate of heaven being used again. Liu Bang was saying that the Qin Shi Huangdi has somehow violated the heaven's rights, and he was appointed by heaven to once again restore China to a more peaceful and prosperous China. His accomplishments: he earned his people's loyalty and trust. Both the soldiers and the peasants liked him. He freed his people from harsh government policies. Shi Hongdi loved government policies. Liu Bang was less government and more free. Lower taxes and made punishments less severe. So if he's making punishments less severe, you could probably infer that Liu Bang probably is not a legalist. After Liu Bang died, Wu Di took the throne. He created a strong government by raising taxes and controlled the supply of grain. Confucianism became the government's official philosophy. Universities taught Confucian ideas. Social classes: based on Confucian systems, people were divided into four classes. 1. Emperor and government leaders. 2. Peasants. That was the largest of them all. 3 was artisans, and 4 were merchants. And interesting, because if you look at this setup, it's very similar to China's as well, and China also borrowed from the Confucian ideas. I'm sorry, Japan. So, classes versus wealth. Classes only divided people into social rank. They did not indicate wealth or power. Although farmers were high in rank than merchants, the merchants were usually richer. So, merchants are last because they didn't produce anything. But just because they're last on the social class didn't mean they were wealthier than peasants. They're just Peasants were looked at as a more honorable profession, being a farmer, than a merchant who didn't produce anything. They just sold stuff. The revival of the family. So children were taught from birth to respect their elders. Father had absolute power. Everyone had to obey him. Han officials believed that if families obeyed their father, then they would also obey the emperor, because the emperor is a way their father, their a father figure. And so it was the idea that if people obeyed their father in the home, then they would then obey their emperor in the country. Some men earned government jobs by respecting their parents. Children were expected to honor their parents through ceremonies. Chinese valued having sons over daughters because the son carries on their name and cares for the parents when they're old. Now let's talk about some art. So the Han became experts in figure painting. This means they painted portraits of people. They painted realistic scenes from everyday life. Paintings covered palaces and tombs. So you can see these paintings, they're actual portrait paintings. They're trying to capture people that they're painting. Um, and they're not trying to exaggerate their features or anything. They're trying to paint them as they are. Two types of poetry. We have the Fu style poetry in Prouse, and we have the Shi style, and it's short verses that could be sung. This is an example. Of course, you can't read it, so I move on. Han created everyday paper. The Han produced books by pasting several pieces of paper together into a long sheet, then rolled this sheet into a scroll. So they produced paper, they would paste them together, and then they would roll them up to make a scroll. The sundial. The sundial is using position of shadows of the sun to tell the time of day. The Chinese are the ones that kind of figured out this piece of technology. Also, the seismograph, which measures the strength of earthquakes. And they also came up with what we call acupuncture, which means inserting a fine needle through the skin at specific points to cure disease or relieve pain. Many of these have gone on. Acupuncture is still used today. Sundial has now been replaced by the clock. And seismograph, we have seismographs even today that tell us the intensity of earthquakes. Farming and manufacturing. Chinese became master iron workers. This made the army more powerful and farmers more productive. Farmers invented the iron plow and the wheelbarrow. Wheelbarrow allowed them to carry up to 300 pounds by themselves. So, Chinese invented the iron plow, I believe it was in the Zhou dynasty, and then they eventually came up with this technology called the wheelbarrow, and it allowed them to carry up to a significant amount of weight, more than they could possibly carry themselves. Another important thing that came out of China is silk. So silk was most valuable thing to come out of China during the Han Dynasty. Chinese were determined to keep how to make silk a secret, revealing the secret was punishable by death. So the government didn't want the secret to how to make silk get out to other countries. And so if anybody in China knew how and they told people outsiders, then they could be put to death. It was a high offense because if well, we'll discuss it in class. The Silk Road. The most famous trade route from the Roman Empire into China was called the Silk Road. Traveling was difficult and dangerous. People would travel in caravans to prevent from being robbed. Traders faced blizzards and deserts, heats, and sandstorms. So we can see here where the Silk Road begins, and it goes up and over and down through here, and that's just through China. Here's a bigger picture here. So we have China, they come up, down, round, come through, come over here, and they come up into the Byzantine Empire. Over here is where they kind of settle, and eventually went on to Rome as well. So Silk Road, one of the longest trade routes ever created in the history of the world, and I believe parts of it is still viable to walk on today. Buddhism comes to China. At the end of the Han Dynasty, people were breaking the law and many Chinese suffered. All this suffering made Buddhism really attractive to Chinese. The spread of ideas from one culture to another is called diffusion. So think about why people in China, at a time when there's a lot of suffering going on, would be attracted or want to learn more about Buddhism. And we will discuss it in our class. So that's the end of our whole chapter on China. We've covered up from the beginnings of China and its geography all the way up to the Han Dynasty. And I look forward to our discussion on the 10th of February in this arena. So hope you're all well. Have a great 3-day weekend and come back to us safely. Bye bye.